super excited. I am to be introducing Vanessa and Sonya to you. Sonya Parker-Goode is the Director of Outreach, Prevention, and Education at the Dallas Area Rape Crisis Center. And Vanessa Baum is the Director of Prevention and Education at the Family Place in Dallas. And I have had the pleasure of working with both Vanessa and Sonya and seeing the work that they're doing. So I'm just very excited to have them here, and especially to talk about this really important conversation and this topic around leadership within our movement. So we'll turn it over to Sonya and Vanessa to further introduce themselves and take it away.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Thank you. Can everyone hear me fine? I'm good. Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so great to see everyone today. Thank you all again for joining us on our session, Trauma-Informed Leadership. We're going to be talking about managing with empathy to build resilience. As Tim stated, my name is Sonya Parker-Goode. I am the Director of Outreach, Prevention, and Education for the Dallas Area Rape Crisis Center. We are a local nonprofit organization in Dallas, and we support survivors and their loved ones who have been impacted by sexual violence. I am co-presenting today with the marvelous, wonderful, passionate Vanessa Baum. Vanessa is the Director of Prevention Education for the Family Place, which is also a local nonprofit in Dallas that helps victims of family violence. What Vanessa and I both have in common, I want you all to know, is our passion for prevention work, for advocating for survivors of sexual assault and family violence. So it's no surprise that we both share responsibility of leading amazing teams who bring awareness and provide education in our communities about interpersonal violence and how we can all work together as a community to prevent it. We are super excited about our time with you today. We want to remind you, as Tim mentioned, we will be discussing or possibly bringing attention to multiple traumatic events that have happened in our communities, in our cities, in our country, and across our world over the past few years. So please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. At any time during this presentation that you feel you need to step away, please do whatever you need to do to help bring yourself back to your center. Vanessa and I will be leading today's discussion, but we invite you to participate and engage with us. We want this to be an interactive discussion. So as Tim mentioned, please use your chat box to ask any questions or to make any comments, and we will do our best to stay on top of that. We will be talking about the consequences of trauma exposure when our staff is exposed to trauma, the differences between compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and burnout. And then we will also take a look at a panel discussion that we had back in January that highlighted an amazing group of leaders who talked about using empathy and trauma-informed care and approaches when leading their staff and their organizations. I won't go through all of this word for word, but again, you know that I'm from Darcy. Darcy is, again, a local nonprofit. We provide counseling, crisis intervention, advocacy services, and my department provides prevention, education, and outreach training in the community. The Family Place, again, empowers victims of family violence by providing an array of services and programs for victims of family violence. Vanessa and I both sit on the DVAC Preventioners Committee. DVAC stands for the Dallas County Violence Awareness Coalition. We are preventioners. We are excited. When we meet, we have a good time, but we come together really to talk about issues that are going on in the community. We talk about new ideas. We are committed to bringing trainings and information to the community that gives people a chance to openly communicate and dialogue about the issues that need to be addressed in the community.
And I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you slow down just a little?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you reminding me of that. You can see here that we are the Preventioners, the DVAC Preventioners is comprised of a number of nonprofit organizations here in the Dallas County area, and we all answer the call to protect and serve. I'm certain that I speak for most all of the organizations here when I say that we are honored to support victims and survivors of all forms of violence. So that brings me to, in light of this hard work, that we do, the DVAC committee decided back in, I think it was before our winter break in 2020, to invite a select group of leaders from different sectors, different backgrounds, different professions, to have a discussion on what trauma-informed leadership would look like and trauma-informed care would look like when turned inward to agency staff. Working in domestic violence and sexual assault settings, healthcare, education, or really any other social service organization can be intensely draining and overwhelming at times. And we just believe that the workplace culture should not be another added stressor on staff. Oh, sorry, Vanessa, I was going to share with them that the idea, this is very important, the idea to create a safe space for leaders to come together and have a discussion about this important topic was born out of, our core belief, Vanessa, if you'll go back to, because I think it's important, to really kind of shape and frame for everyone today why we are really here. We believe that prioritizing the wellness of your staff is very important, and that it can lead to high employee morale, resilience. It can help to reduce burnout, and it can also improve workforce retention. Thank you. So you can see here from this slide that our panelists was comprised of an amazing, esteemed group of professionals, including TASA's very own Rose Luna. All of these wonderful ladies lead teams and organizations that in some capacity or another work to serve the public, whether advocating for those of our neighbors who are in a crisis situation, who are in dealing with an emergency, or providing services that help people understand, cope, and heal after they've experienced a traumatic event. It's just the work, that we do. We understand that our staff can definitely be traumatized and re-traumatized in a lot of different ways in doing this work every day. Few terms that I think I've highlighted here. We talk about advocates. We are advocates in this work that we do. An advocate is, any person that's working in a crisis, emergency or trauma-focused settings. We are all aware that most of our, clients and members in the community that we work with have experienced some type of trauma that they are dealing with. And what we know about advocates is that 2/3 of our advocates are survivors themselves. They are exposed to violence regularly through their work, and they often do this on a day-to-day basis, having experienced and gone through their own personal trauma. And that's what kind of led us to our trauma-informed leadership panel discussion. Right, we're going to talk about ways to expand and understand trauma and violence, and then we're going to also talk about how we are using the socio-ecological model as a framework. And in our discussion, we will highlight not only the importance of self-care at the individual level, but also the responsibility of agency leaders to create policies and structures to support staff in their self-care efforts.
Wonderful. All right, I'm going to walk us through what may be kind of overwhelming at first glance. Please don't feel the need to commit this graphic to memory by any means. This is just one way of kind of expanding our view of what violence and what trauma looks like. This is from the World Health Organization. And so in our day-to-day work in DVSA services, we have this kind of self-directed violence and this interpersonal violence, and that's really what we're seeing on a day-to-day basis. And of course, we know that so many of our staff are also survivors, and this is where, you know, their experiences come into play as well. But really, I want us to look more today at this collective violence. So less about the individual, less about interpersonal relationships, and more big picture of violence and traumatic experiences that affect large groups of people, that affect all of us potentially. And so just like you have sexual violence or emotional violence or neglect as a type of abuse, we experience all of those things kind of as a collective as well. And so before I give some examples of what that might look like, would anyone want to just drop in the chat or unmute yourself really quickly and give us like what you think an example of a collective violence or trauma would be? The pandemic, yep, it's an excellent example. Colonialism and genocide, absolutely. There we're crossing lines between social, political, and economic. Hurricanes and mass shootings. George Floyd, police brutality, police violence. Yep. Absolutely, these are all examples of collective trauma. Government taking native land, absolutely. Yeah, this is kind of what we were talking about at the top when Sonya mentioned that we're going to be talking about a lot of the awful things that we have all been experiencing collectively over the past number of years / centuries, and how those affect our staff on a day-to-day basis, how this is impacting all of us. The insurrection, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I don't need to give any examples. Y'all got it. Racism. Yep, rape culture, all of those things, collective trauma that our clients deal with, that we deal with, that our staff deal with, and it affects us every day, and you can't just put it in a box when you show up to work. Yeah. So basically, you know, advocates can be exposed to trauma and violence either through just doing the work, right? We're exposed to our clients' experiences of trauma. We have it in our personal lives, as 2/3 of us are survivors as well. And then we also have those collective experiences of violence and trauma that we're all dealing with all the time. So we have to think about our staff almost like as like additional clients, where we extend all of this care and understanding and grace to clients, recognizing all of the things they're dealing with. And we and our staff are exactly the same, dealing with all of these things, and need that same amount of patience and understanding and grace. So when it comes to compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma and burnout, we're kind of looking at these as potential results of this exposure to violence and trauma. Compassion fatigue being where, you know, it's almost like you are too tired to care, right? That's the fatigue component, where you have just not been able to refuel and recharge after being exposed to, you know, your client's trauma. Vicarious trauma is kind of the next level up, where it's not just that you need to refuel, it's that there is a fundamental shift that has taken place in the way your brain works, in the way you view the world, in the way you respond to stress, where as a result of this exposure to others' trauma, you have been changed deeply. And then burnout is kind of this, oh, sorry, I was reading Tim's message in the chat. So the burnout is the exhaustion that we experience when we are not satisfied at work, when something in our workplace is not working for us. So the distinction I really want to point out here is that compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma are related to the work that we're doing, right? Because our work is inherently difficult, these are the risks. Burnout, though, is more related to the work environment. It is not something that we experience because sexual violence is a difficult field. It's something that we experience because of something that's not working in our work environments, right? So that's the difference. You know, anybody could experience burnout in any field, but, you know, an engineer is not likely to experience like vicarious trauma, for example, not being exposed to it every single day. But burnout is across the board. If something in our workplace isn't working for us, that's where burnout can come into play. So there's, you know, a little bit of research out there looking at compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and burnout, and where these things come from and how to combat them. And but when it comes to domestic violence and sexual assault fields, there is a shortage of research out there about the experiences that we have in this field that are so unique to us, right? One researcher, just to plug her, she's amazing. Her name is Layla Wood. She is a researcher at UTMB, and she's one of the few out there doing really specific targeted research, which is cited down here below and will be included in a resource handout for everybody, just on what this looks like for anti-violence professionals. So what I've been able to find in the research with the help of Dr. Wood, at the individual kind of level, those things that increase the risk of experiencing vicarious trauma and burnout and things like that are just a lack of coping strategies, right? You don't have the tools to deal with what you're dealing with. Your own personal trauma history increases your likelihood of experiencing vicarious trauma. And then other demographic factors, namely being poor. When you're poor, you are less able to cope with the stresses of the world because you have so many stresses of your own, right? So those increase your risk on an individual level of experiencing these things. I will say that that data is really inconsistent, and it's not super evidence-based across all of the research. It's kind of, some people found an association, some people didn't. The more consistent side is on the organizational level, where we've got consensus across the board about what causes this vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. One is a high workload, which is probably no surprise to anybody. Role conflict and ambiguity, when somebody feels like they're being asked to do something that is not their job, or they feel like they, you know, maybe their job description or their position was not explained very well, so they're not sure exactly what they're supposed to be doing. We see this in rape crisis centers, where people who maybe direct service with survivors of assault is not necessarily their skill set, they work in another part of the field, are being asked to staff the hotline or go on hospital calls, right? That is role conflict. Lack of control over your work, lack of power in your workplace. These can be experienced in any field, not just domestic violence and sexual assault. Lack of quality supervision. So having a supervisor that is checking in with you and discussing these topics and taking time to care about you. And then racism and microaggressions. One of the other factors that made somebody more likely to experience burnout or more likely to leave a job or want to leave a job was simply being a person of color. That increases the likelihood that you are unhappy in your agency. So racism and microaggressions being a huge piece consistently found in every piece of research out there. One question says, now that there is finally research being done on PTSD in first responders, do you think that the research you are talking about in this group will be validated and brought to the forefront as well? I sure hope so. I think that's exactly what Dr. Wood is trying to do. You know, there's a little bit more research out there for, you know, like healthcare professionals and stuff like that, of who we maybe more traditionally think of as first responders. But I know that the work of Dr. Wood is trying to bring kind of our field to the forefront, as well as now these organizations that have sprung up. Some of our panelists that you'll hear from when we get to our video highlights, they represent organizations that exist solely because of this problem in our field. So in their organizations, they're not providing counseling and intervention to survivors. They are providing those services to the staff who help survivors, right? So when we talk about Legacy Collective and Self-Care for Advocates later on, those are two organizations that exist just because we in this field are struggling, and they came from this field and got tired of it and want to fix this. So there's definitely more attention being brought to this area. Something in these organizational factors that I wanted to call out, down here, lack of control over work and lack of power in the workplace. I don't think it'll be any surprise to anybody that the words that stick out to me here are power and control, right? The two biggest buzzwords in our entire field. And look, here they are, right? We are all very familiar with the, the power and control wheel and all the different tactics of power and control. And maybe not all of us are aware that there is a version of that Duluth power and control wheel for workplaces, showing all of the specific workplace tactics to gain power and control over your staff. So all the things that happen in a bad relationship can also happen in your workplace, and they're really not that different, right? So power and control issues here as well. So when we talk about solutions and addressing this issue, as a preventioneer through and through to my heart, will be a preventioneer till I die. The only framework that matters to me is the social ecological model. And so we can think about this kind of violence and trauma experiences in our workplace on these different levels. Where can you find this wheel? We need the power and control wheel. I don't know why I didn't include it in this presentation, but you can. I'm referencing the chat here in case anybody's not watching it. Perfect. Thank you, Kelsey. I was about to drop that. So anyway, the model here, the social ecological model at the individual level, we've got everything about you, right? What makes you more or less likely to be miserable in your job, to experience vicarious trauma, to be burnt out, to want to leave. The relationship level, right? If we're thinking about a workplace, it's your coworkers, it's your supervisors, it's your staff, it's whoever is existing in that space, even your clients, and the kind of culture that's being created in those dynamics. At the community level, we start thinking about like institutions and systems and things like that. So what kinds of policies and practices are in place in your organization? And then societally, we have everything from media messages to federal policies that might affect the climate of our workplace as well. Like the fact that we do not have like a federally, like on the national level, we do not have any sort of requirements for long-term paid parental leave, right? That affects your satisfaction in your job, because if it's not required at the federal level, then the states feel less pressure to require it. So then it's not required at the state level. So your individual employer feels less pressure to provide that, right? So it all trickles down in a not fun way. So if trauma and the dynamics that create trauma and violence within an organization exist at all of these levels, then we have to also implement strategies at each of these levels, which is why simply telling your staff that they need to be practicing self-care is insufficient. That is, it is harmful, beyond insufficient. It is damaging and deeply, deeply hurtful to say, well, are you practicing self-care, but you're not providing them the adequate PTO in which to take that time that they need? All kinds of things, right? So we need solutions, not just at individuals practicing self-care, but also we need supervisors practicing trauma-informed supervision. We need policies that really reflect a deep care for the well-being of our staff. And at an even larger societal level, we need policies like federally to make sure that we are all caring for each other. And also at a funding level, if we're talking society, we have grant funders out there that give us all kinds of rules that we have to follow in order to use their money. So they could also be involving all kinds of rules about how you need to be taking care of your staff and implementing X, Y, and Z policies, right? So if we're going to be beholden to grants, they need to also be working for us. So if any of you in the audience are funders, that is my call to action for you.
Very good, Vanessa.
So the solution is more structural than individual. If you are only emphasizing individual self-care to your staff, then you are blaming the victim, right? If you are not giving me PTO to take care of myself, I cannot take care of myself. All of this is reflected, shockingly, in the most recent definition of trauma and trauma-informed care from the Texas Administrative Code. This came out in February. It's beautiful and I love it. Once again, don't feel free to read all of this and commit it to heart. Just these highlighted yellow sections I thought really emphasize the message that we are trying to send. About how being a trauma-informed organization means acknowledging the compounding impact of structural inequities, right? Looking at how our staff and our clients are going to be impacted by different societal and cultural events differently. Recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, but also in our staff, right? Responding to the impact of structural inequities. We are not just recognizing that, because of systemic racism, people experience, no, we are responding to it. We are doing something about it. We are being called to action. And that we're not doing this just at an individual level, but we are doing this at an organizational level, right? This is structures and systems and being called to action. So next, we have so many videos for all of you. This was like an hour-and-a-half long panel discussion that we've distilled down into roughly 20 minutes of video clips. So we're going to show y'all just the wonderful things that our panelists had to say. And of course, at any time, we'll take like little breaks between each, short clip. And if you've got a question, if you just want to say, OMG, I loved that, like, please do so. We'll kind of ask periodically how people are feeling and how they're responding to this. And I'm going to try really hard to alternate between turning my interpretation on and off as I play this video so we are not all hearing 48 voices. So bear with me. Our first question that we asked the panelists, and the responses that you're going to hear first, were to the question, how do you incorporate empathy into your leadership?
I think we start by just asking questions and being curious and not to label anything. In addition to that, when you're building, when empathy leadership is built in, or it's a way of life, you're kind of covering everybody. So it doesn't feel like we're doing a trauma-informed this and that, I'm not a victim, so why are you doing? It's just, no, I'm a human being, and I have leadership who cares. I have an organization that's kind of the goal, is you don't want it to get into these little silos of, I'm not a trauma, I don't need, everybody needs this culture of care. And today we're calling it trauma-informed because that's a piece of it, but there's all these others. And also, just so y'all know, nonprofits aren't the only ones doing this. You have corporations who have kind of tuned into the fact that productivity levels go up when you care for your employees, when you ask questions.
Sorry, so obviously these clips are going to cut off in random places. But anyway, it looks like in the chat, the audio is working for people. Glad to hear it.
I loved in this, Vanessa, one of the things that Rose said, she talked about asking questions. And, sometimes when we are in positions of leadership, it's the most obvious thing that you can do, but a lot of times it's not happening. So I love the fact that she talked about, just asking questions, because our staff are human, right? They're human beings. And so I loved her response in that.
Mm-hmm. Be curious, don't label.
Mm-hmm.
Rose is wonderful.
Yes, she is.
I think we start by goes up. I don't want anyone to think, oh God, this is other thing I have to do, or oh my God, how are people going to cheat the system? They really don't. I would just ask everyone to please, kind of flip that script of, that's just been again, I'm not an expert in this. All I can speak to is my experience. And ever since I've started, it's been 3 years in this position, it's taken time. This stuff takes time goes up. I don't want anyone to think. I think another big thing is allowing for mistakes to occur. I think everyone is just so afraid to make a mistake that they're going to get fired. Oh my God, you know, or I'm not working hard enough. I'm not doing, you know, whatever the case may be. And I'll just say this as a woman of color, I used to feel that way. Like I had to work 10 times harder to prove myself, or I was just that much more afraid to make a mistake. And I was a single parent and I was like, I need this little, my little pennies that I get every other week to keep my daughter, you know, fed and all those different things. So living under that fear was just not, and not that anybody was placing that on me, but I think it's just the status quo does that. So it's our job as leaders to break that status quo. So allowing people to make mistakes and understanding that it's going to happen, so they're not afraid to making any mistakes. And for those game changer mistakes though, where it's like, oh gosh, you know, that's borderline fireable offense, you know, because I think, I know we've had a situation like that. And what I decided to do was to look at, you know, I saw a pattern. So I tell the staff that it's love, we love and accountability and grace, but accountability, we do need it. Like, and I feel as a woman of color with other staff, especially my other people of color on staff, if there's something that they're doing that isn't up to where I feel like it should be, I feel the responsibility to talk to them about it, not in a punitive way, but in a way to help learn. And I do that with all staff, but I'm just as a side note for women of color, people of color. So, but just making sure that we are honest with our staff when they do make a mistake. Here's how you do. But also, again, the big game changers. Instead of firing, there was one that we had that made a pretty big thing, and I was like, I cannot have this person doing this anymore. Luckily, though, she had other redeeming qualities, and I was like, I want her here, but let me switch this over. And it was just everything aligned. The grant allowed for like me to switch her purview and position to this other thing that was equally as helpful. So it's just kind of, again, that takes time. The easy thing is to fire her, get somebody else in there. So it takes, as I mentioned earlier, time and patience and this, undying commitment to this.
So when let me just jump in real quickly, because I think I was doing a praise dance when, you know, when we had the panel discussion, when she talked about being a woman of color. I mean, you know, all throughout, you know, I know 20s, 30s, 40s, you know, we had this saying that being a person of color, like we always felt like we had to work 10 times as harder, should I say, than everyone else. And so when she said that, I was like, yes, go Rose, go, because it's the truth, you know. And so just being able to, as a leader, to recognize that in your teams that, you know, everyone is different, and you don't really understand, unless you are a person of color, what that feels like to come to work every day and have to or even just feel like you have to outperform every person that you are working with. So again, kudos to Rose. She talked about love and grace, words that we do not use in a professional environment. You know, we do talk about accountability, but love and grace are words that, you know, that's for at home. But she's absolutely right. You know, having, you know, showing love and grace, you know, to our teams and to the staff is just so important for them, especially if we expect for them to grow and develop and build their own sense of resiliency. So just love that.
I know everything Rose said, and y'all will see in our series of clips, it's probably 50% Rose, even though we had like 6 or 7 panelists. Everything Rose said was like a sermon, just wonderful. Yep. Does anybody have any kind of reflections from any of those before we move on? Things are gonna start heating up as we get to the next couple of sections. Also, I love what Tim mentioned in the chat of it taking work to turn accountability from punishment into an opportunity. I think that's kind of almost a larger discussion. This is a total side note, but that larger discussion within our movement of what accountability looks like for people that cause harm to others. And is it just punishment? Right? Or are we looking for restoration and transformation and repairing the harm that has been done? Right? So I think all of these conversations are connected.
They are, Vanessa, because just talking about even, when I think about the historical trauma, of, being Black and all that Black people have had to endure, and just kind of understanding what punishment, looked like for Black people for so long, that is oftentimes what the idea is. It's not about lifting me up or, helping me grow or develop or making me better. It is this punitive, kind of corporal punishment, or, punishment that, is almost the expectation that is going to be had if you make a mistake or if you do something wrong. So I just, love the fact that she highlighted all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Oh, and Erica in the chat says empowering and encouraging strength-based traits in staff, the sense of pride and ownership in their work, and it produces beautiful results. Absolutely. I think that's something, because I'm prevention always in my head, like that's the same thing we kind of think about in working with youth. It's just for working with any group of people. If you're focusing on what you're doing wrong, you're not going to be building relationships. People are not going to be happy, and they're not going to know how to grow and how to change. And they're not going to think that they can be better or that they can grow. Strengths-based, love it.
Yes.
And the added weight that your individual mistake can cast doubt on the abilities of your entire community, race, and culture. It's a lot of burden. Yeah.
Yep.
All right, our next section of responses, and we've got quite a few here, is how do you balance your employees' need for empathy while managing your organization's professional obligations to the community that you serve? So there are going to be a lot of clips addressing this question, because throughout our entire panel discussion over 2 hours, people kept coming back with this same fear. They kept asking, well, how do I balance letting my staff feel their feelings, but also that they need to do their jobs? And when we talked about, giving people space when they need space, we got the question of, well, how much space is too much space? How much space do we give? So people kept coming back with this fear over and over and over again of being too nice and not being able to get the job done. So the next 6 clips will be our panelists' response to that ever-present concern during our event.
This environment, I really had to do some work internally to make sure that, one, I always start by remembering that they want to perform and they are capable of performing. So a lot of the work first starts within me. It's just remembering that, because of course there are things that in this remote environment that slip through the cracks, things that they thought they sent, but it's sitting in a draft email box and it didn't actually get sent. All sorts of things are happening because of the volume we're processing remotely. But when you start with the assumption that people want to perform and they are competent in the work that they do, I think it makes a difference in terms of the grace that you offer the people you work with. In this environment, I really
how does that bring in accountability while you're trying to offer flexibility and support and caring concern? And I think the way the two come together is that you can't lose that emotional connection to the importance of the work, right? I mean, you need to feel that sense of pride and satisfaction that the work is being well done. And so that's how I think of that flexibility and empathy and concern having to be infused with, with some structure and with some accountability. So I'm so glad you mentioned.
I did want to issue just a brief heads up that the next clip will be discussing George Floyd and police brutality a little bit there and how that affects anti-violence staff. Just a heads up for folks.
How does that bring?
Say that that is something I think it first takes us recognizing that there are some events that are going to hit folks at a cellular level that it won't hit other folks at that level. One of the things that we've tried to do at TASA is to really be proactive in teamwork, because there's going to be days that regardless, there's a staff member that's just not going to be okay. And I think that's okay if they're not okay. They like someone else can pick up that slack. And that's what we try to do, is team up with each other. For example, the George Floyd situation, that was something that hit us all, but I knew that the Black staff at TASA, I knew that was hitting them harder. So I checked in with them and said, if you need to check out for today, you need to check out tomorrow, let me know, we'll work it out. We'll cover, we'll do it, things like that. Sexual assault's been in the news a lot. We have survivors on staff, same thing. So we try to, as leadership, we come up with a behind the scenes plan to have our teams kind of help each other out in those times, because that is, again, some of that stuff, some folks feel, again, on a cellular level, it's a whole deep another level that some of us are just privileged and we don't see it. So just recognizing that, and when those events come up, checking in and allowing people that space. But as you mentioned, Krista, you still have to do the work. So we try to have, team members to kind of fill in for them so that they can have that space, because the clients and the work also deserves to have presence of mind. So that's something that we try to do at TASA.
Did anyone have any thoughts they want to share after those couple of clips before we get to the next 3 in this section? In other words, start by believing. Start by believing that they are capable of performing the work, and that once an organization can provide that trauma-informed supervision, performance will be self-evident. That's what I took from it. Yep. Yeah. The very first clip in this section from Judge Parker, who is, shout out, Sonya's amazing sister. She says that it started with her own internal work of believing that the staff want to perform. They want to do a good job. And that being like the kind of shift in thinking that is required.
And the fact that they're competent, right? Because we oftentimes hire the staff, right? So to think that, or to have in your mind that they aren't competent or that they don't want to do the work that they were hired to do, that is often mind-blowing to me. I just, I wonder sometimes where this fear that people just don't want to work, where that comes from and how it shows up and stays so prevalent in our workspaces. Especially in environments, like where we're working to, serve the public and offer a human service where, you have to know, trauma is so prevalent, in these arenas, that if our clients are experiencing these things, our staff are likely experiencing these same types of experiences and events. We can turn on the news at any time and see, daily what our staff could possibly be dealing with. And so it's just always, I think it was Kathleen that talked about the emotional, connection and kind of maintaining that. And, that's one thing that I think as we continue to go on this technological, social media rules, we have lost the connectedness. We've lost the ability to connect with people in general. But I think that if we're, going to be organizational leaders, we cannot lose the ability to connect with our staff, especially working in these environments.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
One of the things that kind of struck me about what Rose was saying is, so like appreciative of working for Rose. I can't tell you all. This is just reminding me all of that again, about all of that again. Anyway, just the piece about like recognizing for a number of reasons, including the cultural trauma that y'all were talking about. Like there will times that people will need to be able to check out, and the importance of that, like teamwork and having like an organizational understanding that that's what we do here. There's going to be times where it's okay for you to check out because somebody's going to step up for you. And that also means later on, you're going to do the same thing for someone else. And so that's a lot of that has to do, like people get really siloed and nobody else knows what's going on. And like all of that is stuff that you have to deconstruct so that you can offer that opportunity to folks to step back when they need to and then to step up.
Yeah, and I feel like that's reflected kind of once again in this larger cultural conversation that we're having about community care and mutual aid, right? It's once again deconstructing these ideas that we hold in society about where your individual worth comes from and this individual kind of self-reliance mindset, and instead recognizing that like we will all succeed together, that is the way we grow and move and advance, is by operating together. And that means that we have each other's back. And sometimes, yeah, like somebody's going to take some time and we're just all going to step up for that person. Community care is the way forward.
Say that, gosh, I mean, this might not be the right answer, and I admit that. I don't see anything as too much space. I think the space is the space. Whatever they need is what they need, and we work around that.
Space is the space.
I know, I just want to get that tattooed on me. I also take a second to see what Tim put in the chat. Said something you said, Sonya, struck a chord with me. I felt like our organizations also don't always recognize that leadership is both a skill that needs nurturing and practice, and that being a supervisor takes time on its own. So often people are put in supervisor positions because they've been doing the work for a long time without leadership skills and training, and they essentially are told, go do what you've been doing, plus be a trauma-informed leader. Yeah.
Yep, I have no idea what's required. And I like the fact that you brought to, our attention again, that it takes time, so this is, I mean, everyone here today is, maybe hearing some of this for the first time, but going back, to your agencies, really, kind of being, as Tanya said, looking internally at what type of leader am I, and then understanding that in order to get here to this place where trauma-informed care in your leadership, it's going to take time, and you just have to start taking, these steps where it could be, as we were talking about doing this session, it was right around the time that, our agency CEO had decided to close our office for a week for us to just have a sabbatical, just because we needed it. It had been a very, very rough last year and a half, and there had been so much that had happened. We were all just wiped, and she recognized that. And as a leadership team, we came together, we talked about that, and we talked about what we could do to show the staff that we care and that we were concerned about their well-being. And, that's what we came up with, collectively, as you were saying, Vanessa, it does take everyone coming together to talk about, okay, this may hurt a little bit, but the greater good is so much more important, right? So we all knew that closing the office and being out of work for a week, we were like, oh my goodness, what are we going to come back to, right? But still, to have that downtime and to just go and recharge and re-energize and not have to worry about work or everything that was going on, or worry about it and deal with it in your own way. It was just really, really nice to be able to do that. So that to me was just an example of trauma-informed leadership at its best. Yeah.
Gosh.
For us as a legacy collective, again, kind of what Rose said, that there is not too much space. As a collective, we come in and out as we are able to provide, because what's most important is the quality of services that we provide. And if we aren't able to provide that with our full selves, then we aren't providing quality services. I would rather have someone who is there to provide the quality service with their full selves than give half effort because their minds are somewhere else. And although that may mean someone is out for 3 months, they're out for 3 months. That is fine. We are a collective, as we will rise together and we will do this work together, and we will take the losses as we come. So maybe that is just reducing our services that we provide, because no matter what services we provide, we want to make sure that they're the best services. So if it's, you know, we're not going to take this project on right now because we don't have the capacity right now, that's what we're going to do. Although as much as we're needed, we don't want to provide something that's not going to be best for any one person or any organization. So I think, as you know, again, such as Rose said, there is nothing as too much space. Things happen all the time, and we cannot, you know, expect life to stop because work requires us to. And I think that's something that would have changed. I think the shift in our mental capacity is that we do not live to work. We work so we can live. And if we are solely living to work, then what kind of quality of life do you have? And we want to make sure that we're able to find happiness within our lives. And that doesn't just mean for our clients, but for us who are also could be clients as well. So we want to make sure that we open that to everybody. So anything that we would expect of our clients, we expect of ourselves. If a client isn't able to provide us that time, then that's fine. It's nothing on them. It's just something they're going through. And we're going to expect the same from all of our staff members that we all hold dearly to our hearts. And you know, again, if that means that we have to let go of some projects, that's just what it means. For us as a
I think as a leader, if I could just contribute this quick comment, I think as a leader, it is incumbent upon you to help people in your organization recognize that often it is the case that you can get done in 2 hours when you're energized and refreshed, what you would spend a 6-hour day trying to do when you're burnt out and tired. And so if we frame it that way and then help them to understand that the way that we're going to do this is we're going to shift things a bit. So this person is going to be off on this date, and you and I are going to carry the load, or the rest of us are going to carry the load. And when your day comes, I'm going to carry the load with them for you. And when you do it in that way and help them to see that we're all coming together to support each other in getting the space that we need to refresh, and it's really not piling anything more on anybody because we're getting out back because we're not so tired. I think as a leader, if I could just.
All right, our next question for our panelists is what shift in thinking is required to lead in a more empathetic and trauma-informed way?
But it's also recognizing patterns of behavior of staff and starting with curiosity as to the source of that behavior. Too many times I've seen staff get labeled as problematic behavior or, you know, something like that, when in fact it's a trauma response, as Jatanda mentioned earlier. So us just being more curious about the source, asking questions, and changing HR policies to reflect this context is also something that we are in process of doing, because a lot of the times, again, someone who has an outburst, oh, they're problematic. No, that's a trauma response. And once you ask, you get to the bottom of it and things are much better.
Kind of the same line as we hear sometimes when people say stuff like, well, if you can't hack it, you got to go. You know, if you can't hack this, we hear that so much. And it's, if you have an organization or a leader or someone on your staff who says something like that, you know, it's like, well, you know, you just can't suck it up, you know, suck it up, buttercup, you know, if you can't just get on it. But then I would question somebody who is saying that, as they may not be the best choice to be working with somebody who's a victim of crime or survivor of crime, you know, of that whole bootstraps mentality, which isn't healthy. And, you know, if we can be calling that in as much as possible and challenging that as much as possible, that can help maybe weed out some folks who maybe just don't need to be a part of the movement right now.
Oh y'all, that was Trace. The last clip was Trace. I love her so much. She's my hero. There's something she mentioned in there about that kind of mentality of, you know, just suck it up. If you can't do this, then you're not cut out for the work. And that mentality, this part struck me so hard. I, not in my current position, but at a previous job of mine, we were being asked to do a lot of things that were not our job description, that were exposing us to a lot of trauma, working too many hours, not being properly compensated for that time. And when people tried to bring up like, hey, if I'm gonna be at the hospital for like 4 hours at 2 a.m, can I come in late the next day? Right, when we would try to make those requests, we were told that, well, you know, if you're not able to do this, then you just don't support the mission, right? Then you must not care about survivors, right? So that mentality is why many people left that organization. It's that bootstraps mentality, right? And it is not healthy, it is not productive, and it is why you lose staff in places that are run like that. So this one really, that part from Trace really, really hit me. The next question, as we were talking to all of these CEOs and leaders in other capacities, was how do they recognize burnout in themselves?
You know, I think just self-awareness and having that self-compassion that Kathleen talked about is so critical. You know, for me, once you know, when I check in with myself and realize you're sleeping an average of 5 hours a night, that's not acceptable. You're missing meals during the day, that's not acceptable. You know, and just kind of go through the list. Like, these are the things that are necessary for my basic sustenance and functionality, and I'm skimping on them. It's not acceptable. And also that people are watching me. I'm leading by example. I'm suggesting to people by having a meeting that goes into the noon hour, a time when people should be eating their lunch, that waving lunch is fine with me. You should do it. So I think those were.
I think that's the only one for this burnout section. We just loved Tanya's part about kind of creating that personal checklist for yourself of what are all these things that have to happen to make sure I'm taken care of, and am I actually doing them?
Yeah, and just being self-aware. I mean, because I know that, you know, in a lot of leadership positions that, like she said, leading by example, it is what you so easily, you know, get, you know, especially working from home. I was always on my computer, always at all hours, all the time working. And it's to the point where even my staff was like, oh, we saw you send an email at 9 o'clock last night. I'm like, as nicely as I could, oh, I didn't mean for you to respond that. Then why are you sending it right at 9 o'clock at night, right? So you definitely have to look at, you know, and be aware of what you're bringing and how the examples that you are setting for your team. So yeah, very, very, very good. Burnout is real, and I know we've all experienced it at some point.
Yeah, and you reminded me, Sonya, like that kind of setting the example. It's like when I think it requires that as leaders, you be hyper aware about power dynamics, right? If you send an email after hours because of the position of power that you have, like, how can your staff interpret that? Well, if they sent it after hours, then it must be really important. And it must mean that I need to respond to it after hours as well, right? And I think that just, you know, like we send it and we think it's no big deal. And it's like, oh, well, of course, we're not expecting a response right now. I just was sending it because I thought of it and wanted to send it before I forgot, which I think is always how I end up in that situation, is I know I'm going to forget. But yeah, if you think about power dynamics, that can seem like almost like an imperative to respond because of power dynamics. as another aside, our moderator for this conversation, Krista, shared that in a lot of emails, there's some sort of function that you can use where if you are sending an email at 11 p.m. or whatever, you can set it to where like you press send, but it doesn't technically send until 9 a.m. the next day or something.
Yeah, she did say that.
I need to figure this out, but I know it exists, just as an FYI.
Yep.
Oh, you can do it for text too, they say in the chat. Good to know.
Oh, yeah, really good to know.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Tim. Please teach me your ways.
Mhm. Someone says, I agree, as a leader, I have to be aware of those power dynamics and we'll be responsible with that. Very good.
Learn how to use O.
Yes.
Yeah.
Here's this question.
Okay, so our next one is kind of once we're able to recognize that burnout in ourselves, is what responsibility do you have as a leader to address that burnout? And what is the connection between addressing your own burnout and creating a positive organizational climate?
We also talk, particularly my staff team talks a lot about exhaustion and just, I'm so tired. So we have a lot to do with we almost call them accountability buddies, where it's like, hey, you know, have you stopped today? It's 11:30 and you're sending me something. It's time to rest. It's time to transition. So, you know, into let's go watch an episode of Supernatural and rest and just have a break from this. And they call me out also, which I think is also incredibly helpful when you're in a position of leadership. You have to, particularly when it comes to empathy, I think, and when it comes to the tending to the culture that you want to see, is that you also have to be held accountable, and you also have to let people know when you're struggling. Let's see, can you share how you cultivate an environment where folks are comfortable calling folks out? Oh, yeah. When we started SCFA, we all have had a lot of experience with leadership that was abusive. We had all had experience also with organizations that were severely traumatized. You know, that was a conversation when we were putting the pieces in place of what we wanted to build together. And one of the things was we wanted to make sure that everyone felt safe, that we were creating a safe space together for us to have hard conversations. But we were also wanting to make sure that we were all creating a brave space so that we could not only handle criticism, but also be able to have accountability when there was an issue. And that's been really, really helpful. Let's see.
Out there, you know, Rand Stagen, an executive business coach who founded the Stagen Institute, he says leaders get the organizations they deserve, and that principle sort of undergirds the way that I try to, you know, support my team and manage the court. And that principle, in living by that and working by that, is also what allows me to assume that they want to perform and that they're capable of performing, such that I'm able to give them the space they need, whatever it is. My feeling is that, you know, if you've got issues with people who are underperformers or slackers or people who you give in an inch and they're going to take a mile, likely those issues existed apart from the pandemic, should have been dealt with outside of the pandemic. If they weren't dealt with by you outside of the pandemic, in the pandemic, with the trauma of an insurrection, racial, social justice issues, and otherwise, is probably not the time to deal with them. And so I think that, you know, approaching, giving them time and giving them the space that they need, and then walking them through, okay, you know, we want to see how we can support you in returning, and having that conversation. I think you really, if you didn't deal with performance issues, in that person before this, I think you got to offer a little bit more grace in walking them through some of these difficult things that we're facing, and perhaps be a little bit more patient with them being able to come back.
That's huge. I'm sorry, this is Rose again. That is huge. That's a huge problem that I'm seeing also, just to be completely honest, in the field that I work in, which is the Rape Crisis Center, sexual assault programs, burnout. I don't know what's going on, but I do know what's going on. It's a lot of everything going on, everything at once that's happening on top of just the crisis, day-to-day crisis of working with clients of sexual assault and domestic violence, you know, every day. That is a really good question, and it's tough, but you know, it's the leaders. We have to be better. We have to recognize that in ourselves, because some staff may feel comfortable coming to us and some may not, and it's just going to continue. And then board of directors, some of them are very active and get this and may ask the executive director or CEO, or some are like, hands off, that's your problem, not my, you know, so that leaves the staff just stuck in this toxic wasteland. That sounds harsh, but it's true, you know. So I think it's as leaders, we have to recognize that, and we have to take cues from staff. I know staff, and I'm saying that, and I'm the first one to know that I work too damn much and I need to stop. And I have staff telling me, Rose, it's 9:30. I don't want to see another email. And I'm like, oh gosh, you know, so I'll stop. So I want that accountability. I need it from them. They're comfortable doing that with me, but I'm not sure that's the same with across the board. So I think the onus of that is on leadership, and that needs to be a new, like on the job description or something, because it's really hard to have staff, you know, address that with leaders unless they're open and ready, because it will create a toxic, and then it, you know, anyway, I'll stop. But yeah, that's
is leaders have to be willing to be courageous enough to hear when there's a problem. Yeah, we have to, and I think the other issue is that if one person that you supervise tells you that there's a problem, then you have a problem. You can't just gaslight it away. It's a problem. I grew up my adult life in the sexual violence field, and I can personally attest to the burnout and to the issues when it comes to leadership not being willing to hear that, but they have to be. And if you are brave enough to be an executive director in rape crisis or any of the helping professionals, that is really scary work. It's intense work. And the thing is, if you're brave enough to do that, then you're also brave enough to hear when your people are telling you that there's a problem and to do something about it. You know, we cannot lose phenomenal advocates because leadership is too afraid to deal with their own trauma. Like, that's not okay. And we cannot expect our advocates to become martyrs to our cause because we are not willing to take better care of them by taking care of ourselves.
Another whole sermon. Whew, so good. We have a couple more clips left, but we're also getting really short on time. So Sonya, what do you think of, like, if we just kind of summarize what the next, okay. So this section is like what changes to policies and procedures people had made to try to reflect this more empathetic and trauma-informed approach. One response was from Kathleen Laval at Dallas CASA, who mentioned during the pandemic, she noticed when everybody was working remotely from home, she noticed that there was a huge decrease in people using their paid time off. Because it was kind of like, what's the point? Like, I'm going to take time off just to sit in the same room that I'm working in. It felt pointless. And so she knew that that meant people were not taking care of themselves. They weren't taking that time that people need to recharge. So she put in policy that everybody would get 5 personal days. Personal days don't roll over, so people felt more like of a push to use them. And it kind of kick-started people taking that time off off to take care of themselves just by giving everybody across the board 5 extra personal days. So that was one thing that they did just as a quick, easy policy. Something that Rose mentioned in this section was when she came on board with TASA a few years ago was looking at salary equity. Saying that salaries at TASA were kind of all over the place and inconsistent and did not reflect a living wage for Austin, Texas, which is just an absurd place to live. Don't know how any of you do it. But Rose said that was one of her kind of top priorities. First thing coming in was to make sure that everybody was getting paid an Austin, Texas living wage. So another kind of policy change there.
Yeah, and one other thing, just real quick, Vanessa, I think Judge Parker talked about not being afraid to change things up. You know, like for example, you know, she noticed with her staff, especially during the pandemic, you know, a lot of people had to move in with, you know, family and share, you know, spaces, and so she found and, you know, recognized that meeting times that used to work for her team no longer worked for them. And so they had to go back to the drawing board and discuss, you know, what works. So we have to have 7 o'clock meetings. That's better for everyone. Then we'll have 7 o'clock team meeting. If we need to do this at, you know, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So not being able to change, you know, sometimes people get stuck in that this is the way we've always done it, but we can't be afraid to ask, you know, our teams, ask our staff what they need, what's going on with them to help you make a better decision about what will work collectively for everyone in the organization.
Absolutely. The next question was just about measurable improvement. Like, are we seeing significant changes in the organization as a result of making these changes? And here, Kathleen from Dallas CASA again mentioned one thing that they look at is just attrition and turnover. Right? Dallas CASA, I can tell you that we have Dallas CASA staff sit on the committee that Sonya and I are on, the coalition. And in our monthly meeting, when we go around and share, you know, what openings we have at each agency and what the needs are, every month, Dallas CASA has 0 openings. They're never hiring because nobody leaves because it's such a wonderful place to work. So high turnover, that might be an indicator that something's not great. And if you have really great staff retention, that's a great measurement to show what the climate is like. The other thing Kathleen mentioned was doing an annual employee satisfaction survey where you're asking all kinds of questions about, you know, are you satisfied with the amount of time off that you're getting? Do you feel like, are you satisfied with the educational opportunities and trainings that we provide for you? Do you feel satisfied in your work? Just actually asking how people feel, right? Taking everybody's input and listening to everybody being a great way to get those measurements as well. Anything you want to add, Sonya? Anything I'm forgetting?
No, I don't. I can't recall. I did, you know, even for myself after we went through this, after we had this discussion, I went back, you know, because I don't know if it was Judge Parker or if it was Kathleen that talked about the importance of creating your own, as a leader, creating your own checklists where, you know, you're asking yourself questions, you know, almost kind of checking in with yourself daily to see if you are actually providing, you know, these trauma-informed, you know, principles with your staff. And something I found that was really helpful for me, and I just kind of typed it out and, you know, stuck it up in front of my, you know, computer, just helped me to ask myself these questions every day was safety. Are you creating a welcome environment? Trust. Are you sensitive to the needs of your staff? Choice. Do you provide opportunities for your staff to have choices? Collaboration. Do you communicate a sense of doing with, you know, everyone inside of your organization? Empowerment. Are you focused on empowering? And then the final thing for me, which was really huge, was a respect for diversity. Do you value and respect differences in people and you know, that everyone, you know, is have a very diverse workforce and culture, and we need to be able to respect that and identify that not every person is the same and not every person operates the same. And it's our responsibility as leaders to recognize all of that. So, yeah.
We wanted to kind of leave you all with this quote from Trace from one of the clips that you saw, but leaders have to be courageous enough to hear when there's a problem. If one person tells you there's a problem, then you have a problem. You can't gaslight it away. Oh, beautiful.
Amazing.
I guess we wanted to open it up now for questions, comments, soapboxes from anyone. We've got a very comprehensive handout that as soon as I stop screen sharing, I will drop that link in the chat for y'all, full of each panelist that we had shared some resources. So those are all on there. All of the sources that I used in this presentation, those are on the packet. There's extra toolkits and handbooks for trauma-informed check. I mean, it's comprehensive, so I'll put that in the chat now.
I
don't know, any questions, comments from folks? There was one comment, Kelsey, you said that this was really reinvigorating and validating. I just want to say I attended a session from Trace Fleming Trice with Self-Care for Advocates a few years ago at the national conference and had that same exact feeling of being like validated and understood about what it's like to work in this field for the first time ever. So I feel you 100%. Let me find that link for you all.
Not only did you identify problems, but you gave ideas and probable solutions. Thank you. Very good.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's how we felt when we had the panel discussion. It was like, oh, yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah, and as much as like, I don't know, sessions where you're just kind of identifying what's going wrong, that can be really validating too, but it's also frustrating when you're left thinking, well, like, what do we do?
What do I do now?
And I think a lot of people in here, it seems like maybe some people might not be like leaders in their organizations because you're kind of talking about hoping the leaders in your organization take this to heart. In that resource handout, there's one link that is on like how to start these conversations with leadership in your organization. So for those of you that are not the agency leaders, hopefully there's some helpful stuff in there as well for how to kind of start nudging information that direction.
Or you could create another email and send this recording to them.
There you go.
No, don't do that. Don't do that.
Or you could give us their email and we'll send it to them.
Yes, exactly.
We'll be shady.
For it. Yes.
Let's see in the chat, would love to explore more options, especially in regards on how to address this with funders. You know, me too, because this is something I think about the complaints that we have. You know, like in the early 90s, VAWA was great. It gave federal funding to a grassroots movement for like the first time ever, but then it also came with all these strings. And we talk about that all the time about how getting especially government grants kind of limits what you can and can't do in situations. And I'm thinking that if our grant funders can put these restrictions on us that make things hard, can't you also give us some restrictions and requirements that require we take care of each other better?
Yeah.
I don't know where we start this conversation, but I don't know if you know somebody that we can email some resources to. I don't know.
Very good point.
So I don't want to speak for like all of the TUSA leadership team were rows, that would be problematic. But I feel certain just from other conversations we've had that, folks, we do often have audience with at least some of the funders. And so going to have some conversations about some of the common things that are getting in the way of the trauma-informed leadership and trauma-informed policies. Then those are conversations that can at least try to have. Wouldn't guarantee any sort of success, but we can at least start having those conversations, and even just identifying what those common barriers are, I think would be. We have had some conversations in the past with folks, with funders, not necessarily around trauma informed, but around like when there was a big influx of money, like you have to recognize that like people can't just turn around an organization and use that money right away. There's infrastructure, and so we were able to do some. Rose in particular was able to do some advocacy around that. So
yeah, I think that even like Kathleen mentioning that they do an annual employee satisfaction survey. I think that's maybe not super common at a lot of our organizations, and so even just a really simple ask like that, if it were attached to some grant funding of like, you have to evaluate your climate every year. The same way that we have, requirements on, higher education institutions to do full climate surveys every single year. Like, that would be a great place to start. Somebody said, can we talk about how writing some of these grants / pandering to these systems for money is traumatic in and of itself? Oh yeah. Especially when you're reading how it's like, with these funds, you are not allowed to do this thing that you're like, that seems like a good thing.
That's the thing that is the thing we need to do.
Yes. If anybody is familiar with signing contracts with the state of Texas, you might be somewhat familiar with sections I am referring to. It can feel so gross to have to air out clients' trauma for money. Yeah, issuing client stories, for development purposes sometimes feels questionable. Yeah.
So I just wanted to say thank you so much. It's obvious from the text chat and the comments like that this was such an important conversation. And so thank you so much, Sonya and Vanessa, for having this conversation with us.
Great.
I hope these conversations continue. I want to take just a quick minute to thank Gabriella and Tanya for interpretation services. Again, helping us make this more accessible to more folks. And I have posted it once. I think Kat has posted it once too. I'm going to post it again. Please feedback, fill out those surveys, let us know how it went. And just thank you. Again, thank you, Sonya and Vanessa.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for being here and all that you've shared.
Thank you to everyone that
Thanks
came.
to everyone. Yes, we appreciate it.
So I hate doing this, but I am going to close this out in a minute. I hate doing it. I really do. Such a good conversation. I want to make sure folks have a chance to take a break before we start with the keynote this afternoon at 3:30. Again, thank you so much. Thank you for all your time. And we'll see you in a little bit.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.